Okay, shall we just get started? I'm pretty certain
Sure.
some people might be running
Yeah,
late.
no, that's absolutely fine.
Fab. So, hello everyone. It's our third Journalists Insights webinar, and today we have the wonderful, the one and only Doug Mackenzie, who is the host and producer of Fintech Finance. I had the pleasure of meeting Doug in person last year in Lithuania, and we've been having conversations ever since. And we thought, with your background, your skills, and everything that you know about fintech, it would be pretty much incredible to get that. So thank you for joining us today.
Well, thank you very much for having me. And yeah, it was actually a really brilliant trip when I went over to Lithuania to see the FinTech Inn over there, and absolutely loved it. So, well, thank you for having me once again in the webinar.
Thank you. So let's start with the very basic questions. So obviously you're a host and a producer of Fintech Finance. So can you tell us a little bit more what it means to be a producer of videos and series on Fintech Finance? Because just before we had a couple of more people, but they were predominantly journalists who were writing a lot. So tell us more about that.
Sure. So my role at Fintech Finance is pretty expansive. The role producer covers so many facets, especially when it comes to fintech. And that was before COVID even changed all of that. But before COVID, we would typically run 3 to 5 in-depth documentaries a month on a particular financial services topic. And that would range anywhere from insurtech, fintech, wealth management, KYC. We'd get into all kinds of different issues, and we'd get a number of speakers, and it would really be my job to make sure the speakers that we got featured were from reputable banks or from tech companies, and put them together. Then once I had that, I would then work on a script that would tie all three together and kind of create a singular back and forth between all three participants. And we'd typically have 3 participants within one episode. So sometimes we would have, for instance, a large retail bank let's take, for example, our latest one just before COVID. We went to Mexico. We got Galileo, an ecosystem provider. Then we got Klar, a startup bank there, probably one of the most exciting startup banks in Latin America. And then we got Belvo, a company that really helps open up APIs for banks. And so, yeah, we'd typically put them together into one big thing and get some nice B-roll and hopefully make it quite exciting, because I think that is the issue. And probably one of the main differences between a writer and the producer side of things is you've got to look at the visual aspect as well as obviously making an interesting story. And so I would definitely spend a lot of my time, because fintech can be dry if it wants to be sometimes. And so visually you would have to work quite hard to try and get something quite interesting from that.
Absolutely. So tell me, what is your day-to-day before COVID life looked like, when you turn up to work? Of course, you said you traveled a lot, but tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so day to day we'd typically travel twice a week to a different country, and we'd interview. Interviews take about 45 minutes. We'd set up, film the bank at their offices. We always typically film at their offices to get nice logos, everything like that. Then we'd come back, and I would then work on getting the next guests for the next week's episode booked in. We typically look at C-suite level executives from banks to fit in the episode, and then write the script for them. And as a result, I've got lots of talking points with a lot of the press teams at various different banks, but also at loads of different tech companies as well, who like to be in the episodes too. So my day-to-day would typically be on the phones trying to get these very time poor people on camera. And a lot of people don't like being on camera, especially if they're not if you know they're not trained to be on camera, it's very hard to talk about. And try and get them on camera, and then for the rest of the day write scripts for various different ones, and send feedback and previous videos to video people that we've already interviewed.
But I assume getting C-level executives is not an easy task, you know, first of all, because you said they're extremely time poor. Secondly, what I find, especially with fintechs, you have a lot of very technical guys who are CEOs who either don't want to be on camera, don't like to be on camera, or, you know, they just said that they don't see the value of it, but they will be like, do I really need to do that? So what kind of miracles are you trying to pull, you know, to get them there?
Yeah, so it requires a lot of back and forth with press teams generally, and marketing teams. You know, we're pretty open. We're the nice guys, we like to say, when it comes to video editing, in that we offer them the chance to actually be able to look over the video, make sure that nothing, you know, nothing too, you know, in case someone says something wrong in a way that they didn't mean to, they get a chance to look over it once more and really make sure that the product is actually going to be along the lines of their PR.
Okay, so and this is something that we spoke about before we started broadcasting, the differences between, you know, being a producer and being a writer in journalism, because as we said, you know, in fintech there are a lot of announcements when it comes to funding, or, you know, getting some big dogs on their board members, board teams, and etc. So you have the news that is there, you know, someone secured 10 million pounds, you know, and you have to write it right away. With producing videos, it's not as easy because there's just so many things involved. Obviously, research and making sure that everyone's booked in. Then you have edits. Then you have edits again and edits again. You know, just until it actually comes to life. So, what are the other differences, you know, when trying to look for a story? Because if, let's say, someone pitches you about the funding, you know, securing funding, that might be something of your interest, but clearly, you know, you won't be able just to go like that there and try to do something about it.
Yeah, I think it at the end of the day, it's a real an issue with the fintech industry as a whole, in that it's often product led rather than story led. As a result, you have to kind of look at a product, and if the product has some legs and is going to go on for a very long time, then that is the key part of what we look for. Often, as I said at the beginning, our episodes used to focus on very broad topics within and issues effectively, and challenges that the banks are seeing. And that's what we typically would look to focus on. So we can actually have input where banks actually have to describe some of the challenges they've had, what they've been working on, and the tech companies can do a bit of both by say, this is how we help the banks, but also show how, you know, the differences between the tech companies and the banks. And recently it's been really interesting to see how the banks have actually been coming out on top when it comes to effectively catching up to these tech companies. But that's what we typically look for. I always wish that there was more stories in fintech. I'm starting to see more as fintech drifts into charity work, and especially with COVID. Yeah, obviously we can talk about that later, but the way that fintech itself has helped a lot of people during this time, especially when it comes to payments, or, you know, being able to be lend tech. There's finally some really exciting stories out there. So I'm excited for the state of where fintech will go when it comes to newsworthiness.
Okay, fab. And let's kind of zoom out of your role a little bit. And because obviously fintech is an extremely hot topic, as well as fintech is a relatively new topic still. So tell us how fintech journalism came about, maybe in a few words, and how did you realize that you want to be a part of this industry?
Yeah. So in my eyes, I've only been in the industry effectively half a decade now. But there are some, to coin the phrase that you used earlier, there are some big dogs in the media side of things. You've obviously got your TechCrunch, who have been around 15 years, I think. And I think that this is a two-pronged approach to to really how fintech journalism came about. And half of it came from the tech side of things. As I said, the tech crunches, and then finance drifted into that. And then the other side, from what I can gather, it really started out of consultancy work. For instance, obviously everyone looks towards 11FS, and having not only the established speaker roster within their own organization, but also the interaction with the banks on a daily basis, creates that brand interest and ramps up a lot of views. And I think that is really where fintech journalism started. And then as it became increasingly democratized and people realized that now they could get a Monzo on their phone and onboard themselves in a new bank account within, was it 52 clicks, I think I saw the other day. On their phone.
Too. It was crazy.
Yeah. Then obviously more people started to get involved.
Okay, and so what did you do before joining Fintech Finance? Was it for you a gradual move? Maybe you worked in finance before, or was it just something that you felt passionate about and said, like, this is what I want to do. I want to produce videos. I want to travel the world. I want to do everything related to fintech.
Well, I definitely think it was a large portion of what you just said at the end there. So I had just come back from teaching at a university in central China.
Okay.
And on my phone, I had apps like WeChat. And within that, I was able to book my flights when I went on holiday. I was able to book my train tickets. And I think this is correct. I was already on 4G. I was messaging my friends, still on 3G. And I just assumed everyone had it. I assumed that the equivalent back in the UK was the same. And I found it very interesting that you couldn't pay on WhatsApp when I came back. So that's because on WeChat, it's obviously a wallet as well. So that's where I first really found out about fintech. So when I moved back, I actually saw an advert in my hometown, where my boss, Ali Patterson, I just put out an advert saying, need someone who loves to travel, and is pretty good at being busy all the time. So I jumped at it, not really knowing what it would entail. And 5 years later, here I am now. Yeah. And before COVID, flying around the world, interviewing banks in what felt like at the time, every country in the world.
So when it comes to fintech, some people, when we talk about fintech, whenever you hear the word, a lot of people relate and assume that it's just startups, right? Because there's just so many fintech startups nowadays. Some other people say that fintech is absolutely everywhere. So tell us, what is fintech? Where we can find it? Where is it?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, in that I wish it was more prevalent. I still go to a lot of my friends and tell them about these innovations, and they're either not relevant or they've never heard of them. And I find that really interesting that despite finance being such an important part of everyone's lives, it's still not an everyday talking point. And I don't know if that's cultural in the UK. It's very awkward to talk about money.
I think it's everywhere. It's awkward to talk about money. This is like a no. Yeah.
Exactly. And as a result, I think that's a major hurdle already. No one wants to talk about how much money they have. No one wants to talk about how much money they could make, especially not in polite conversation. It's not something you would just talk about at the pub typically. But I think that is starting to break down. And I think that's probably been the issue when it comes to the definition of fintech and its prevalence, is that cultural shift. And I think it's starting to change, as now when it's become very acceptable just to instantly, because I know I keep bringing up the challenger bank example, and I bring up the payments example when it comes to fintech, is the ability to literally just split a bill with your friends instantly. And there's no longer any of this arguing. I used to remember, you'd go out for a holiday and there'd be 14 of you around a very large table, and everyone's arguing, no, I'll pay, or there's some people that never want to pay, and it would always be this very awkward dynamism. But now I'd say that fintech has become established in especially when it comes to payments. I think that's what most people think of it. And then the other element is wealth management, and opening that and democratizing wealth management and lendtech to an infinitely larger population than have ever had access to it before. You now have your Wealth Simples, other fintechs along similar lines, and banks that are now using those technologies to allow their customers who particularly wouldn't have had that portfolio to finally start managing their wealth in an incredible way, which I think is, the definition of fintech.
It all goes down to education, doesn't it? Because as you said, if we don't feel comfortable talking about money or any other money related matters, it's harder to educate people. But also, I think when it comes down to talking to your friends, families from, I think, like smaller cities. So, when I'm spending loads of time in London, it seems like everyone knows about Monzo, Revolut, Starlink, all the fintechs seem to be there and everyone knows about them, and you have like 50 cards that you use whenever you go. But to be honest, when I was visiting some of my friends in Bristol, and I said, Revolut, Monzo, such a great card to have whenever you go abroad. You don't need to pay some extra money whenever taken out, or paying in different currency. And some of my friends were absolutely baffled. They were like, didn't even know that anyone needs that.
No, exactly.
So it comes down to education, and I think spreading the word. But I guess because there's so many fintechs nowadays, so many, and fintech is a very hot topic, it's quite difficult maybe to figure out what is the real deal, and who just wants to jump on this hype wave and be out there.
I completely agree. And I think it's really interesting, the anecdote you gave was in Bristol, which in my mind, I think isn't it like the fifth biggest city in the UK?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, and to me, it's very cosmopolitan and metropolitan. But it just shows that as soon as you do leave even the London bubble, fintech plummets. And I think maybe fintech journalism is helping to improve that. But if it's going to take that leap, it needs to finally find the use cases, as you said, the products, whittle down the chaff, and actually provide products that people want, rather than products that are just helping banks actually operate in a quicker way than they could, and in a more cost-effective way than they could have been 20 years ago, if they had actually evolved digitally like a lot of other industries. So I'm always more excited, especially from a video point of view, to have stories like that which affect the B2C, or the customer, rather than ways to help banks operate better. But obviously that's still very important and goes hand in hand. But I think fintech journalism, since it is a very product focused story rather than an issue based story, is always going to rely on those big releases, much like any standard tech journalism.
Absolutely. And you mentioned, digitization. So do you reckon that since COVID started and it's still going on and probably will go on for slightly longer, has it accelerated, everything becoming more digital? Do you reckon that traditional financial services companies will come out post-COVID, reinvigorated a little bit more? What are your views on that?
Yeah, 100%. So I've had 2 interviews that have specifically talked about this. One with that Mexican challenger bank, CLA, which I mentioned, and one with Nationwide Building Society here in the UK, their head of customer channels, with Carol Lizelle. And in Mexico, which is a cash-dominated society, COVID alone has changed the DNA of payments over there, and it's turned it from being cash to increasingly more digital. And that's just on the consumer side of things, but also within the bank. The CEO, he told me that they went from working in an office, occasionally having to swap papers with colleagues, ferrying notes in between each other. They went to complete working from home, completely working digitally within a day. Wow. And I know that's just a challenger bank, but it's still interesting that they were able to action that within a day. And that says a lot about the technology more than the size of the institution. On the other side, Nationwide, which has one of the largest retail banking branch sectors in the UK, Carol Lizzell took a very different approach. She was obviously very aware that it was increasing digitization, but also how much of a role having these occasional bastions of branches dotted around the country are going to be. Having that approach to providing for the community. People can go there because suddenly when you're furloughed, money becomes far scarier, even if you are getting that money in. And having that support network is still going to be incredibly important. And they were working on having that same level of support digitally. And I think so not only is it changing the way that the bank's operating, it's changing the way that payments are being actually transferred. And it's also changing customer experience in a far quicker way than it probably would have happened if this pandemic had never happened. It might have accelerated it half a decade, I think.
It's quite fascinating because I think everyone lives in their own bubble, right? So when you said that Mexico is very much, powered by cash in the society, it might come as a lot of surprise to people, once again, the ones that live in London or, the ones that live in Europe, and you use only cards. I know in Lithuania, some of the cafes don't even accept cash. It just says, cards only.
Wow,
so
that's a very Baltic thing, isn't it?
It is like either or.
Yeah.
So, that is quite fascinating. But that goes down, I think, once you travel a lot, especially as a journalist, and kind of seeing all these different countries and cultures and how they cope with it. So what trends do you see, besides, let's say, what's happening in Mexico right now, in terms of, the regions that you visited? What were the fintech trends, maybe in the Baltics, you went to Hong Kong recently, what is happening there?
Yeah. I guess, to lead off where you ended, Hong Kong's really, really exciting because I would still argue cash-based, but there are so many different players in it when it comes to using QR codes, and then you've still got the card adoption as well. It has a very established financial institution core. You've got big banking players already there offering debit cards. But you've got the younger generation that are banking with these Chinese companies, the Tencents, the Alibabas, the Weixings, and they're just using QR codes. And that plays into a huge, an interesting trend in the fact that if these private companies like WeChat have your details when you make a payment, they are then starting to create a social credit score from those payments. But because they're also the social network side of things, they are also gleaning all that data because their chats aren't encrypted. So WeChat actually is it's offering its own credit score. Mm-hmm. That's very exciting and scary because they are reading through their customers' messages as well as their purchases. So not only are they getting a full perspective when it comes to payments, but also your social life, who you're interacting with. And so your WeChat credit score is now based on your friends, what you buy, how you buy it, how often you buy it, and what you're talking about. And that could obviously...
absolutely crazy, no? Yeah. Clearly there's some sort of privacy breach in terms of, like who your friends are and who you chat with and what you buy and how much money you spend on things.
And I think that's probably one reason why I think Asia, when it comes to fintech and payments and AI, is going to be so fascinating, because there is no privacy law in China. Effectively, there's no anything like that. The amount of data that they can pull on an individual is so much more colorful than anything that we could possibly pull in Europe, Africa, or Latin America or North America. And as a result, the AI actioning that can take advantage of some of those inputs is going to be vastly more clever and could actually provide better financial services for those people. Obviously, it's very scary because all we think about is, well, why would we ever offer up our privacy to, for instance, the state or WeChat? And I think that's why we're going to see some really exciting technologies come out of Hong Kong and China in the future when it comes to fintech, because of how rich this data set is from AI.
That's great. That does sound like the Black Mirror episode.
Yeah, it's very, very Black Mirror.
Are there any other fintech trends, let's say, in the Baltics, because you visited us last year, and that was the first time that that you visited Lithuania, is that correct?
Yeah, it was actually my first time in the region. I'd only been to, on the other side, I've been to Finland and Sweden, but never down into the Baltics. And it was really interesting to see I think the biggest and most exciting trend I saw there was how closely aligned the government was working in terms of coordinating and facilitating innovation. And that started all the way down from education, which we mentioned earlier in the chat was so important to increasing not just fintech literacy, but also fintech adoption. And I think having that two-pronged approach effectively was so refreshing to see. At the Fintech Inn, we saw various different members from the government having an input onto the industry. And I haven't seen that. I mean, as I mentioned, I travel the world going to these fintech events, and it was really refreshing to see. And a government so preoccupied with facilitating this particular industry that I've been working in for half a decade. So that was a really exciting trend. And I think that's only going to, as education increases in fintech, we're going to see some really exciting things, especially in Lithuania.
Have you been to Latvia or Estonia, or you haven't visited them yet?
Still never been. Okay. No, not yet. But they are on the list. I think. Because well, I was just going to say it's probably going to be more of a summer trip for me than a winter one.
It was really cold, because I think maybe when you visit Latvia and Estonia, would be interesting to see the differences, because obviously the Baltic region, we're very small, but there's a lot of different comparisons about startups that are coming out from there. So that would be interesting to hear your thoughts on that. And what about Western Europe? Who would you say is the leader? Obviously the UK. With whatever that is happening, and I think
I don't want to sound proud.
Well, you should be.
So if I was to follow my own earlier statements, that I believe that fintech is really categorized by the payments and wealth management scene. Payments in the UK is probably more advanced, apart from maybe Holland, than the rest of Western Europe. Germany is still very cash dominated. Holland is still very much dominated by just Maestro. If you don't have a Maestro card, it can be difficult to get money out from an ATM. And I think the ubiquity of having these fintech banks based in London, obviously Revolut as well, over in Lithuania, but having them started up here creates that, I don't know, maybe a loyalty. I don't know, but it seems to have been adopted here very quickly. And I mean, if we would, and Wealthsimple also, all the wealth management companies as well are based here. There are a lot of exciting fintechs actually in France. And I think they just need a bigger adoption from the large financial institutions in France. Whereas a lot of the big banks in the UK have actively looked to try and catch up with these fintechs. So I would categorize Western Europe as being UK, but obviously if you were to look to Northern Europe as well and consider that Western Europe, Norway and Sweden, when it comes to payments especially, are leaps ahead of even that. I even had an interview with a banker in Denmark, and he was bemoaning having to teach his very young child that money isn't grown on trees, because children, even up to apparently a very quite late stage, now believe in the Northern European countries that all you have to do to buy something is press a button on an iPad or tap a card and you get it. They had no concept of actually having to transact and losing that cash that a child in other countries may have kept onto in a piggy bank or something like that.
But it goes down to what we're talking about, education. And I do think that fintech has a lot of impact on, as you say, young people, even children, because Fairly said, money is not growing on trees. But then again, I think when you go in schools, a lot of times there's no such thing as, managing your own finances. If someone in school would tell me that I need to put 10% aside from my first salary, if I want to save up for a house or something. Exactly. Yeah. And it is really, really interesting to see, as you said, that it's not just, a tap on an iPad, but then it goes down to the consumer, right? What impact it has on the consumer, because Revolut, Monzo, and the likes, they started out because people were traveling so much and everyone wants to save a bit of money. So it was, by the end of the day, about the consumer. And it's absolutely fascinating. And any other countries? So obviously, Latin America, you mentioned Mexico. Anything else there that is you think will be growing quickly?
I think when it comes to Latin America, Brazil has some huge, I can't name them off the top of my head, frustratingly, but Brazil has some huge challenger banks that have a user base that I think the European ones, I could be wrong on this, but I think their user base is vast. And that's completely changed the dynamism within that ecosystem. Because now the institutional banks like Bradesco are having to reel and think, okay, what are people buying? And, I visited Brazil and I didn't see any crime. Apparently there is a lot of pickpocketing and stuff like that. As a result, that's a huge, huge change. Having digital currency is only going to become increasingly popular there. I mean, even trying to go to an ATM, I got stuck in a turnstile with a guard and an assault rifle. And as someone who's not used to seeing guns ever, that was quite an interesting change, cultural change. So I think Brazil, when it comes to challenger banks, will be really exciting to see where that goes.
Okay, so out of all regions that you visit, or even countries, which one fascinates you the most, and which one do you think has the most impact, in terms of fintech?
I'd say, in terms of going back to what I said earlier, what interests me the most is China, because of what they can pull from that data set. It's not going to be replicable to any other ecosystem because of the privacy laws around the world. And so from just a purely kind of almost sci-fi version, I'm very excited to watch where that goes. Obviously, from a very selfish perspective, I really want to see where the UK takes banking here, considering that a lot of the fintechs are based here. Maybe some of their steam has slowed down because of Corona. And maybe this is actually, when I first started, everyone was saying, oh, the fintechs are going to take the market share. The banks haven't digitized yet. Why haven't they everyone was in panic mode. And now when I go to, in February and March, I was going to banks, going to NatWest, and they were completely calm. They were saying, yeah, it's actually, we're happy to work with fintechs. Bring it on. We're excited. We've got our own teams here now as well. And so I think this kind of collaboration approach, rather than confrontational approach, is very exciting for such a small industry. I mean, how many banking players are there compared to other industries? It's going to be very exciting.
And this is something actually that I was not thinking I will ask, for just posting to my Brexit, right? Because you've mentioned that the never-ending Brexit. Because you've mentioned that there are loads of fintechs in the UK, obviously, all the major banks there, and pretty much all the other major players are there. The interesting thing, what I saw, because we work predominantly with fintechs from the UK and from across Europe, that the British fintechs started looking where else to go. simply because they were scared. The worst thing about Brexit, let's face it, is just the unknown. Like same
Yeah,
with
it's the
COVID,
fear.
we just don't know what will happen.
Yeah.
So do you think it changed much? Because whenever I'm in the UK, talking to some of the banks and stuff, it does not feel that there's any change coming anytime soon. Clearly, there's loads of different documents, bureaucracy, paperwork, etc. But do you think fintechs would be slightly more scared, maybe trying to get into the British market, or it will still remain probably the market, in Europe, if not in the world, for finance?
Yeah, so obviously it's such a huge topic. I think what started out as being very scared, and you saw a lot of large institutions obviously having to move sections of their business to Ireland. And I think Ireland and Amsterdam in particular are going to do very well out of it. But one thing that is also not talked about too much is obviously the significant heritage that the UK has when it comes to finance, and the fact that the strength of London, to the detriment to the rest of the UK probably, is the fact that you can go to every bank you want in 3 streets. And that's definitely not going to change. But one thing that might change now because of Corona is actually that congregation of people in one place. Mm. And then suddenly having that smaller market, because the UK might have different regulations to the rest of Europe, that could be something to play. But I think at the end of the day, the UK and its heritage when it comes to finance, and it's certainly in the very short space of time that fintech has at least been uttered by just the average person on the street, it shows that if anything, the regulator here is going to continue its trend of being a trend setter. And while I shouldn't comment too much on Brexit, I do think that at the end of the day, it might actually come out in this industry in particular quite successful for the UK because of its heritage and the fact that the UK government is so obsessed with finance. It wants to make it sure that it is the most competitive, the most innovative, and they've never been afraid of taking risks. And I think you can see that from the FCA throughout many years of innovation.
Absolutely. So that was a cheeky question. So what do you reckon will happen? What the trends will be like post-Brexit? Well, can't say really post-Corona, during Corona, in terms of fintech. What do you think is going to be interesting and new? Because payments, it feels that it's not that we've kind of reached the limit of what can be done, but it's not as novel anymore. So do you think there's going to be something more exciting coming out?
This is one thing I was actually quite sad to hear from a lot of institutions. I won't name names, but it's effectively a backpedaling now, where we saw a lot of innovations planned for this year. And as a result, with a lot of organizations, you're suddenly actually having to look what's realistic, what's something that we can attain, and it's actually probably going to be a reduction of things. We've seen, for instance, Monzo's scaling out west. Their manifest destiny effectively to the States curtailed. That they cut jobs in their customer service side in Vegas. So I think just the expansion of fintech may take a backseat as people just want to kind of, in fact, we've even seen numbers drop in the various different banks onboarding. And I think people are going to be less carefree effectively with their money and maybe install less fintech apps. So from, not to sound like, a very negative point of view, from an innovation side of things, when innovation for innovation's sake, I think we're going to see that reduce. What I think we're going to see is innovation where things probably should have been cemented years ago. The fact that, maybe you can have someone to talk to about your money, no matter what size budget you're on. And customer experience is obviously going to become incredibly important as a result of COVID. That's my prediction.
Okay, so we have another 15 minutes. I do have a few more questions in terms of startups and how they can get international coverage if they're not from the UK. And I see we have a few questions which we'll answer towards the end. So guys who are attending, feel free, just to drop in a Q&A and we'll go with it. So working with PRs, startups, businesses, and agencies. So we've interviewed a few journalists that are working in digital publications they're writing. And obviously they get pitched on a daily basis. They get hundreds and hundreds of emails. And out of that 100, probably 1 or 2 is going to be relevant. Do you, as a host and a producer of Fintech Finance, also get hundreds of emails saying, hi, we're doing this, please make a video about us, or please write about us, if they clearly didn't do their research?
Yeah, I mean, we do have that written side of things, and we do actually have a magazine as well. Being the host and the producer of the show, yes, I get about, it's probably nowhere near as many as the written journalists that you had before. But I typically, I had a holiday on Tuesday, and I opened just not in terms of other emails, but in terms of just PR companies trying to get their story out. It was 50 within the first half of the day. And then that's not including the ones that you get on LinkedIn or WhatsApp.
Do people pitch you on LinkedIn?
Yeah. And not as much as email. And weirdly, yeah, it used to be, I'd probably say at the beginning, a bit more over the phone, but now WhatsApp. So we definitely do get a lot of stories, and it is hard, as I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar. It is a very product-driven thing. Finding a story within that, it can be difficult, and hopefully, as fintech becomes more universal, it democratizes, we will start to see more of those stories.
So out of your, let's say, 50 emails per day that you get, how many of those do you find relevant at all?
Is it mean if I said 1 or 2?
That's very fair.
Yeah.
Just wanted to. And, because I was so surprised when you said that someone is pitching you through LinkedIn, because I know journalists, like to be pitched via email, obviously, via Twitter, and that's about it, because telephones are kind of a faux pas nowadays. LinkedIn seems to be quite professional, and it's weird to me that someone is pitching you via LinkedIn. Are you okay with that? Like, do you actually accept pitches via LinkedIn? Would you like to receive more of those? Is it more, maybe that's how people get through you quicker?
I think, yeah, actually, I now you mention it, I think this is probably a question you might ask later on, is actually how I'd prefer it over LinkedIn. There's something, I've always said, people buy people. And so for instance, you and I knew each other before when we met in Lithuania. And so when I see an email from you guys, it's immediately catching my eye. And I think when you go on LinkedIn, there is a face attached to it. However, much it's filled in with a personality or whatever, you still have that instant connection. And it could be, and you don't have to click on the link to already see the first couple of lines. I mean, some of the messages I get on LinkedIn are people saying stuff like, oh, our companies have very similar portfolios, let's get discussing. And I'm thinking, well, what? I've never met you, and be discussing what? And there's so many more questions, and you just have to be like, no, okay, I'm out. So I'd actually, even though I have just dismissed it, you do get some, when they're straight to the point, and they have that face attached to it, it can be quite successful.
Okay, so that's a tip if anyone wants to pitch you after this. So, we've mentioned during this webinar, I don't know, millions of times, that there's so many fintech startups, so many CEOs, founders, and whatnot. So it's very difficult to kind of pick the ones that you write about, especially as a journalist. So is there a secret ingredient to catch your attention, when you are a new company? Because when you're just starting out, you might not necessarily have like a very fancy track record or some huge deals coming out. So what are you looking for in a startup if you're thinking of writing about them?
Yeah, and for me, it's always mass appeal. As I mentioned before, fintech, it can be a very niche audience, and the story isn't compelling as a result. It's only affecting a very small amount of people. Yes, the transfer between two large banks is now sped up in a more regulated way. Hooray! That's great, and it is important and it is necessary. But when you see an application that can be used and be interoperable around the world, that's when those are the stories that you live for. When you think, I'm going to be able to travel the world, use this application to make my life easier, make my friends' lives easier, and ultimately make money easier and safer for everyone around the world. Those are really the stories. If you can capture that imagination, I think that's the key. Not to sound too overly imaginative about the the industry itself, but
it's about the impact though in the end, right? The impact
exactly.
that it will have on someone, instead of just this is us, this is the product, full stop. We do have a few attendees that are not from the UK, and obviously UK is so important in terms of fintech, and all of the fintech publications are predominantly in the UK and English speaking ones. So if you end up, let's say, in Fintech Finance, TechCrunch, or any other credible big publication, it's a big deal. But when you are a small startup, let's say from outside the UK, whether you're from the Baltics or from France or from Holland, it might be slightly easier to get into the credible publication, because what I see a lot of times what journalists are looking for is relevancy, right? So you might have a fantastic product and you really want to be in fintech finance, yet it's not really relevant to the public that you guys obviously are serving. So do you have any tips for the non-UK based fintech startups? What do they need to do to get your attention?
Yeah, and it does actually kind of feed back what I was saying just then, is the interoperability of the product or the service. And if it can be applicable to various different geographies, then that's huge. If it can't, but it's really, really important for that one area, it still can be very interesting, but obviously it then has to follow that exponential importance to geographical interest. For instance, we cover QR codes all the time, even though I haven't used one in 5 years, because we know that pretty much most of Central East Asia use QR codes for making a transaction. And I think maybe a strength of Fintech Finance is the fact that we do travel the world. So we do tend to cover quite a lot of different geographies. But yeah, I think really trying to find that story and make it a very human story, going back to the whole LinkedIn approach, and explaining how in that culture or in that geography, it is actually a really big issue. Going back to that human element rather than a product element, that already speaks volumes. And I'd love for the industry to go far more into that than just standard products.
Okay, thank you. So we do have 3 questions. I'll read it out for you. And so the question number 1 is, why do you think fintech media is so concentrated in London? Why haven't more fintech outlets taken off in other parts of the world?
Yeah. Well, again, basically, I was sounding like an advert for London, this whole webinar. I do apologize. Maybe it is as you said, the lingua franca. It started off with, was it WorldPay in the 80s, and then obviously you did have the challenger banks here, and it's just having that established connection, and the fact that you can talk to various different institutions immediately, and then obviously you then get the impact, the fact that the article can be exported worldwide because it is in English. now, and then you get the American market that can tap in, and exponentially you're getting more viewership. So I think that's very important. But within, so for instance, I've seen a lot of French fintech media, and that's again probably because of the strength of French effectively being the second language of the world, and French is exported around the world. So I have actually seen, probably after English publications, French publications being second.
Okay. Question number 2, and this is actually something related to the US. Given the challenger banks are digital first, why do you think Monzo, Revolut, and M26 are not doing so well in the US?
Probably, firstly, regulatory. I think it's 50 different regulators for one country. And also, as we brought up earlier, probably my core tenet of fintech is when it's coming to payments. And I'd argue American payments, the ecosystem is so laggard. It still has such a supreme addiction to cash. Last year, I was in Virginia, just outside of Washington, DC, and I saw a sign saying chip and pin coming soon, like as a celebration. And I saw another chap. His POS terminal offered me contactless. And so I did it cheekily. He didn't offer it to me, but the POS terminal clearly said tap. And he was so taken aback by it, he didn't believe it, that he made me have almost, he didn't accept the payment, even though a receipt came out and everything like that. Obviously these are completely anecdotal, but the American payments landscape is frustratingly not card. It's still definitely mag stripe. And so again, it might go back to education and cultural differences in terms of being able to just transfer money on the go. But at least in New York, hopefully we should start to see a bit more success. But because
you would expect that it's obvious, isn't it? But then once again, maybe just because we're coming from these bubbles, we're paying with card everywhere. I don't know, in a cab, right? In the UK, in a black cab, you can also now pay with a card, which was unusual till a couple of years ago. Yeah,
and it's absolutely brilliant. Even in Spain, you just jump in a cab and everyone takes contactless. And I guess that's probably the strength of the European Union, is having that unified, codified, regulatory approach to things, where suddenly you can go across borders and there's no issue. You're absolutely fine. But going between New York and New Jersey, there's probably a different regulatory. I can't actually comment on that particular anecdote, but there's, starting up a company there, it has got to be incredibly frustrating.
Okay. 2 more questions we have. So what are your thoughts on open banking in the next 1 to 2 years?
Yeah. Again, it kind of going back to what we started on, is I'm very excited by it. I'm sad that maybe some of the kind of higher end innovative ideas aren't going to come to fruition from the large banks or the challenger banks, as everyone looks to kind of minimize the loss that they've got from Corona. But I still think there's a place for open banking that's going to be really starting to help critical services that have probably needed to be helped in financial services for ages. And as I think a lot of companies are looking towards each other for help now, they're trying to say, well, how can we actually look to work together? You only have to look at adverts for banks nowadays. They're all talking about sticking together. Come on. In the UK, it's almost incessant. You get an advert every on TV or on YouTube or wherever, of people just kind of home video-esque adverts of banks saying, oh yeah, let's stick together. Come on, we need to help each other. And I think that's going to be really interesting, going from maybe, as we said, that kind of combative nature to finally embracing open banking, which a lot of banks have talked about, but maybe they haven't actually fulfilled. And hopefully that collaborative approach will finally become a thing.
Totally, because I think there are quite a few really interesting fintech startups that are working within the open banking. And it just for banks, the big traditional ones, being able to adopt those and accept that, they do need the change.
Yeah.
Because as you say, it's a collaborative approach. So one can actually exist without another, but it's going to be much more efficient if, people collaborate.
Yeah.
Okay, and the last question that we have is, what was your favorite interviewee or most exciting conversation you've had, and why?
Oh, God. So to put it into perspective, when we do a lot of event coverage, and when we're filming at an event, my director doesn't like to do under 100 interviews a day in the course of the event. So, I mean, I could typically be speaking to anywhere between 25 people on camera. So it's constantly that's really put me on the spot. I guess recently with Corona, it's probably been my interview with DBS over in Hong Kong, going back to that China side of things, and hearing how it's effectively a blank slate over there. Corona's happened, but they can just effectively move on from that and continue. And so that was with Mehdi Swidi. He's the head of fintech of DBS in Hong Kong. And so it's his job to source the fintechs, take them through the entire bank, and then hopefully make a value use case to bring them in. So it was a really exciting interview to hear someone that has to keep their ear on the ground to new technologies, but also then help the fintechs actually make it, rather than bring them in, they fall to the wayside, and then that's the end of it. Hopefully, and I trust him, he's a good guy. Hopefully, that we'll start seeing some really interesting fintechs coming out of DBS, which is already such a digitally native bank effectively. They're so good when it comes to innovation over in Singapore. It was absolutely brilliant.
Okay, and we do have last question and a
Sure.
couple of more minutes to go. Is what are your next destinations once COVID is over? When will you visit Estonia, the birthplace of a lot of exciting new fintech startups?
Well, I mean, I'd love to go to see Estonia. I mean, my degree is actually in history. How did I get into fintech? Who knows? But I mean, obviously, there's a lot of history over there. But pre-existing documentaries that we had lined up still need to be fulfilled. And so for the next interviews we've got San Francisco, South Africa, Ghana, France, and then in Asia, Indonesia. And that's just in the weeks as soon as lockdown goes. So I'm very excited for it. I looked slightly miffed there. I think it was just remembering that I was going to have to leave my little housey bubble that I've got going on here. But I'm so excited. I think we're going to be talking to hopefully Gojek, the app that has effectively made an island nation the width of the United States. People that typically transact via card, mum and pop corner shops, be able to transact via card, use their services just digitally. So I'm really excited for that one. And I'm also excited to go to sub-Saharan Africa because of M-Pesa and the phone adoption there when it comes to payments.
Okay, fab. And yeah, it's already 2:00 UK time. So I think everyone's going to be slowly logging out. So before we end this wonderful webinar, do tell us what is the best way to stay in touch with you if someone wants to send you a pitch, or where they can just follow your journey traveling around the world.
Yeah, well, I'm probably going to kick myself for saying this, but being quite a gregarious person, I quite like to chat with people. My number's pretty easy to get, especially the Fintech Finance one. Give us a ring. If the story is interesting enough, people will want to actually say it on the phone. I know it sounds crazy. Yeah. It's very easy to write a boring story in an email and then send it over. But actually, if you can talk about it and get us interested, or at least the people that be working on the stories at the start, then that's a huge amount of the legwork going. Also, as I mentioned, LinkedIn. Again, I could be myself at this, but yeah, always put, you know, a face to a name, and attend events. You know, that's where we started. We started off. That's where we made our name. We attended pretty much a fintech event every other day, and that, again, that helps being in the UK. But we attended with a camera every other day that we weren't traveling to a fintech event. We'd film everyone there. And so if you're in an event, you'll probably get seen by someone. Obviously events are currently put on the back burner for a bit, but you know, that kind of idea, that face-to-face interaction. And oh yeah, and the best way to watch our stuff is obviously at fintechf.com or YouTube.
Perfect. Thank you so much for your time, and thank you so much for joining us in these turbulent and weird times and sharing your expertise. It was invaluable to hear it from you.
Thank you for having me.
And everyone who attended will receive a link to YouTube with this video, as well as we'll send out the written Q&A with Doug, so you guys would have it all written out nicely with all the tips. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.